Welcome to Murder Mile UK True Crime. This isn't a video, it's an audio experience. The only images you'll need for this episode are these. So close your eyes, open your mind, and savour the sounds of Murder Mile. How did a veteran prostitute shame one of Soho's most infamous gangs? Find out on Murder Mile. Today I'm standing outside of 3 Peter Street in Soho, W1. The same building where Eliza Higgs wept after her baby was beaten to death by its babysitter. Where Jacqueline Bivy was murdered by a disgruntled client. Where the eviction of Elizabeth Valad led her into the arms of a serial killer. And where one man poisoned hundreds in Soho, but never learned his lesson. Coming soon to Murder Mile. Oh yes, we visited this building many times before in its grim and disturbing history. Currently, it's a designer boutique called Supreme, where kids, with legs like pipe cleaners, faces devoid of smiles, and an inability to wipe their asses without vlogging about it, queue up outside for hours in the hope of buying what looks to me like a bland white vest for 80 quid, ripped jeans like a tramp's used it to clean a barbed wire fence for 300 quid, and some seriously ugly trainers that a rapper has probably exclusively puked on for a fee, only for the buyer to then instantly sell them to someone else, who sells them to someone else, who sells them to someone else, none of whom ever wear it or touch it, but instead frame it and film it as they tug themselves off. But the history of this building wasn't always full of privilege and joy, but sex, greed, and death. On Monday the 12th of May 1975 at 2:40 p.m, 2 prostitutes on the first and second floors of 3 Peter Street were entertaining their clients. With these small flats connected by a communal door, their punters rang the right bell for Jeanne, the left bell for Sheila, and were greeted on the stairwell by the correct prostitute's maid. It was all very businesslike and efficient for these 2 professional women. But with a campaign of violence between 2 rival gangs having torn apart this side of the city, as bad men did bad things for selfish reasons, 2 women would become the unwitting victims of the Syndicate. My name is Michael, I'm your tour guide, and this is Murder Mile. Episode 311, The Hooker with the Heart of Gold. For more than a century, Peter Street has been synonymous with one thing: sex. As a small impoverished dead end, off Wardour Street and on the corner of Begg Street Market and Walker's Court, Peter Street has always been a place of destitution and prostitution. As when there's vulnerable victims to exploit, there will always be monsters to rule them and money to be made. Back in the 1970s, at the precipice of its sordid squalor, bar a pub and a school, almost every building on this 3-story street of shame had either a striptease, a peep show, or a mucky bookshop on the ground floor, with a gambling den in the basement, and the small flats above converted into brothels. Like the uniform of a closet pervert, men in crumpled raincoats dashed from door to door, with sweaty brows, flushed faces, a stiff walk, and a 10-pole in their pants, as they either snuck out with a brown paper bag of pure filth plastered with boobs and bush on every page, or headed upstairs past a sign-reading model for 3 minutes of bored grimacing, only to be topped off with 2 pumps and a squirt. It was a stinking, rancid cesspool frequented by drunks, addicts and deadbeats, avoided by cops except those on the take, and with the opposing dens of depravity being ran by rival gangs. Tempers flared, blood was spilled, and soon the stench of scorched skin would fill the air as bodies burned on Peter Street. The morning of Monday the 12th of May 1975 was as ordinary as any other. The streets were grimy owing to the binmen being on strike, London was still reeling from the Moorgate tube crash. Britain had its first female leader of any political party in Margaret Thatcher, and the Vietnam War was over. At 10 a.m. on the dot, being punctual as ever, the familiar shape and sassy swagger of 63-year-old Jeanne entered Peter Street. She was sweet as a pie, happy as a canary, and neat as a pin. With her hair always coiffured, her nails polished, and never a ladder in her stockings. As she tottered in her fur coat and heels from her modestly stylish flat at 127 Mount Street in Mayfair, where as far as we know, she lived alone. Jeanne's real name was Jeanne Odette Juliette Weston. She was born in France on the 11th of July 1911. She had lived in Soho and Fitzrovia since at least the Second World War, and as a veteran prostitute who had worked this neighbourhood for decades, she was a mother figure to any newbie on the streets. She was quiet, polite, and never made any ripples. If she passed anyone in the street, she'd always say, "Hello, dear," and ask about their loved ones. But she rarely spoke about herself, so her mystery can only be gleaned from clues. Being big-hearted, she regularly gave to cancer charities and fed the homeless children. Weston was a married name, and although she wore a ring, her husband was never seen. And although said to be the proverbial hooker with a heart of gold, for years, if not decades, she had saved every penny so she could finally escape this life forever. To the side of the adult bookshop at 3 Peter Street, she polished the doorbell on the right as she entered the black door and ascended the thin wooden stairs. As usual, she waved to Sheila Lawrence, a 35-year-old sex worker in flat 1 on the first floor. And as Jeanne ascended to flat 2 on the second floor, she was greeted with a hot cup of tea by her maid, 56-year-old Mrs. Pietrina Conzimu, known as Rena. Jeanne and Rena had worked together for years. Arriving early, Rena always got the flat ready. Split into 2, the back room consisted of a sitting area for clients, a kitchen hob where she made them a warm cup of tea, a lockbox for the day's takings, a radio to play something soothing and erotic, nudie bags on the table, as getting the client hard was half the work done. And in the front room was Jeanne's bedroom, with a double bed, fresh sheets of pinks and lace, a vase of flowers, condoms, and the smell of lavender. This was the way it had been for years. It was clean, relaxing, and safe. But with the building being ran by the infamous Vassallo gang, long-established pimps from the Sicilian side of Malta, by 2:40 p.m, both flats would be engulfed in an inferno, and these women would be burned beyond recognition. Death would come to Peter Street as greedy men meted out violence and vengeance. But there was nothing that Jeanne and Rena had done to spark it. Far from it. Prostitution had changed very little in the decades since Jeanne had sold sex in Soho. Cash was king, names were anonymous, girls were sold like cattle, and rival gangs slashed and hacked to carve up the city for themselves. By wartime, the French pimps had lost control of the sex trade. As Roger Vernon was incarcerated, Red Max Cassell lay dead in a ditch, and Maltese Sicilian gangs like the Messina brothers had muscled in. The Messinas built the foundations of the Maltese Sicilian stranglehold on the West End sex trade, and what would later be known as the Syndicate. As a Sicilian criminal family from Malta, whose father made his fortune enslaving vulnerable young girls to sell their bodies in seedy brothels, by the late 1940s, the Messina brothers, Eugenio, Carmelo, Alfredo, Salvatore and Attilio, ran 30 brothels on Queen Street, Bond Street and Stafford Street, with 200 of London's most expensive prostitutes being Messina girls. Later bragging to the press,
"We Messinas are more powerful than the British government. We do as we like in England."
This was true, as having paid off most of the Met Police's senior officers, they ran amok without arrest, kidnapping women from Belgium, France and Spain and forcing them to marry their pimps who had acquired British passports. They could never be deported. The Messina's downfall came on the 3rd of September 1950, when investigative crime reporter for the People newspaper, Duncan Webb, published a front-page article with the headline, "Arrest these men," complete with a full exposé of the names, dates and places of their criminal empire. With Parliament demanding that the Met's corruption be stamped out, a task force under Superintendent Guy Mahon aggressively went after the brothers, and in March 1951, the Messinas fled the country, leaving England forever. The collapse of the Messina's empire didn't end the sex trade in Soho, as other Maltese and Sicilian gangs simply stepped in. One was the slightly depleted Vassallo gang, and the other was called the Syndicate. In a classic rise and fall story almost identical to the Messinas, the Syndicate was headed up by two men. Bernie Silver, a self-confessed, working-class Eastender with a taste for fine foods and flashy clothes, who through prostitution, pornography and racketeering rose up the ranks to be one of the West End's most infamous crime bosses. And Frank Mifsud, also known as Big Frank, an 18-stone ex-copper who made a name in Soho's criminal underworld, being known for his violent temper. He was also there in the Carlisle Club in 1948, when Amabile Rika, the so-called terror of Maltese London, was murdered. Like the Messinas, they started out small by bullying and threatening local businesses. Starting off with a strip club on Brewer Street, by the late 1960s, the two owned 19 of Soho's 24 strip clubs. And although in 1956 Silver was charged with living off the immoral earnings of prostitutes, even though there was more than enough evidence to convict him, the judge closed this open and shut case, and Silver walked free. And yet it was changes in the law that made the Syndicate both rich and powerful. Under the 1959 Street Offences Act, the maximum sentence for living off the immoral earnings of prostitutes was 7 years. And with sex workers being fined £60, £1,700 today, for soliciting on the street, the Syndicate simply moved everything inside. Between 1967 and 1972, they forcibly acquired the leaseholds and freeholds of between 25 to 30 flats in Soho. When in strip clubs in the basement, sex shops and even legitimate stores on the ground floor, and brothels above, of which the prostitutes paid them £100 a week to rent, the equivalent of £3,000. Sidestepping the law by placing postcards advertised in phone boxes, punters made appointments by phone, and Silver and Mifsud never met the girls. Frontmen always collected the cash, and all of their premises were under someone else's name. But for the girls, life was hard. To cover the exorbitant rent, many worked in 12-hour shifts. Most were assaulted for not earning enough. And although the Syndicate at its height collected over £100,000 in rents every week, that's £1.9 million today, the girls were never protected from punters or pimps. The Syndicate didn't care about any of the girls. All they cared about was their own wealth and power. In court, prosecutor Michael Corkery stated,
"These men have made a very rich living."
Silver himself owned a deluxe Knightsbridge flat, a twin-engined yacht, a Rolls-Royce, and properties in the Channel Islands. With the 1964 Obscene Publications Act, which criminalised the possession of anything obscene for profit or gain, as the notoriously corrupt CID commander Rolly Virgo was on the take, as well as most of the Met Police's Obscene Publications squad, they bribed Detective Chief Superintendent Bill Moody to grant them a license to sell pornography, which made their premises immune to police raids. The 1960s and 70s were dangerous times for prostitutes like Jeanne Weston, as frictions between rival gangs escalated, especially on Peter Street. As the Blue City Strip Club at number 30 was ran by the Syndicate, and directly opposite at 2 to 3 Peter Street, Jeanne and Sheila worked in a brothel ran by the Vassallo gang. With the police in the Syndicate's pocket, the Vassallo's sex shop and brothel was often raided by the Met Police, who smashed and looted everything under the guise of the law. And even though these women were merely innocent pawns in an ever-escalating war, every time they were raided, they just swept up and carried on. The 1960s and 70s saw a spate of petrol bombings at strip clubs and brothels in Soho, as rival gangs vied for control. 3 of which, in 1966 and 67, were committed by Anthony Cauchi and Tony Gallia. But as the gang's leaders always liked to keep their hands clean, it was said that they had been arranged by Frank Mifsud. One of which occurred at the Gigi Club at 62 Frith Street, as we've covered in the 5-shilling striptease. Convicted of manslaughter in 1969, Maltese frontman John Borg of the Vassallo gang was said to have been offered £4,000 to take the rap for an unnamed vice king. But instead he vanished with £20,000 of the gangster's money, and in 1978 he was found burned to death in a bedsit in Shoreditch. And during their rise to power in 1956, a protection racketeer called Tommy Scarface Smithson, who was attempting to take over the sex trade in Soho, was gunned down at Blondie Bates' boarding house in Maida Vale, having been shot in the arm and the neck by a Maltese gunman called Philip Elul. Convicted of murder alongside Victor Stampanato, Elul escaped the death penalty. He served 11 years in prison, and by 1974, being found sleeping rough on a park bench in San Francisco, although he'd agreed to give evidence against the man who'd organised the hit, Frank Mifsud. Reneging as he feared for his life, this was just another piece in the puzzle which saw the downfall and the collapse of the Syndicate. In 1969 and 1973, with an expose by the Times and News of the World newspapers unravelling their criminal network, Silver and Mifsud rapidly started destroying their files and selling off any properties. The criminal group broke up, and before the clubs could be raided by the Met's new anti-corruption gangbuster, Detective Chief Superintendent Albert Wigstead, being tipped off by corrupt officers at Scotland Yard, Mifsud fled to Switzerland, Silver to France, but falsely believing that the case was being shut down by his bent coppers. Silver returned to England and was arrested on the 30th of December 1973. DCS Wigstead and his team raided every club and brothel ran by the Syndicate. And with a detailed ledger found at the home of Silver's associate, Jimmy Humphreys, which listed all of their payoffs to the police, Detective Chief Superintendent Bill Moody was sentenced to 12 years in prison, and the 1967 to 77 corruption trials led to 13 detectives being convicted and sentenced to a total of 90 years. From the 20th of September 1974, for the next 4 months, the Syndicate's ringleaders Bernie Silver and Frank Mifsud were tried at the Old Bailey before Justice Geoffrey Lane, along with their frontmen, Anthony Mangton, Romeo Saliba, Frank Melito, Emmanuel Bartola, Victor McAuliffe, Lawrence Agius, Nazarene Gallia, Frederick Brett, Vincent Stevens, and Joseph Mifsud, Frank's brother. All pleaded not guilty to conspiring to live wholly or partly off the immoral earnings of prostitutes, with McAuliffe, Mifsud and Brett also accused of the kidnap, bribery and assault of one of the Crown's witnesses, Frank Dyer, who was merely a bit player in the Syndicate's network. On the 24th of September 1974, with Silver and Mifsud being practically invisible as they always kept their names off the paperwork and did most of their dealings through middlemen, desperate to prove that they were the ringleaders, the Crown called their key witness, Francis Vassallo, a self-confessed ponce and so-called nightclub owner who had worked at the Blue Moon Club making membership cards for the Syndicate, which was used in evidence. He even stated he had a conversation with Victor McAuliffe, who openly bragged about their business, their methods, and the strip clubs and brothels they ran. Found guilty on the 20th of December 1974, their paltry sentences led some to suspect that the jury had been paid off. Melito McAuliffe and Mifsud, Frank's brother, got just 2 years. Romeo Saliba agreed to return to Malta, so he walked free. McAuliffe and Brett were found not guilty of kidnapping. Bartola and Mangton got just 5 years, plus a £10,000 to £15,000 fine. And although the ringleaders of this multi-billion-pound gang, which left hundreds of women beaten, broken, and even dead, Bernie Silver was sentenced to just 6 years with a £30,000 fine, and Frank Mifsud to just 5 years. Upon appeal, they were both acquitted. It was a pitiful example of the law only serving the rich and the powerful. The syndicate was dead, but what had any of this got to do with Jeanne Weston? Nothing. Nothing at all. It was never said whether the order came down from the top, as bosses like Silver and Mifsud never got their hands dirty. But the target was the Crown's key witness who had fingered them all, Francis Vassallo. From his cell in Wormwood Scrubs prison, it was said Victor McAuliffe, frontman for the now defunct Syndicate, arranged for his cousin, Joseph Frendo, a minicab driver from Stepney, to put a hit on this rat. To give them both an alibi, he ensured he was visiting Victor in prison at the time that the incendiary bomb exploded, and having allegedly hired 2 Maltese men, John Everett, not his real name, and Alfred Tabone, a bookmaker's runner, to plant the bomb. They would both be miles away when Francis Vassallo died by inferno. The problem was, having blabbed to the police, some say to erase his own crimes as a pimp who lived off his wife's own sex work. Vassallo feared for his life, and knowing that soon he'd be as good as dead with a hole in his head and his bullet-riddled body found rotting in a boggy ditch, he fled to Malta. Francis Vassallo was gone, but they didn't need to kill him to kill him. As a message of the fate which awaited him when eventually they found him, they just needed to kill the one person who he loved, his wife Margaret. The afternoon of Monday the 12th of May 1975 was clammy, and although Peter Street stunk of jizz, fag ash and rotting litter as the bin men were on strike, it was so warm many had to open their windows. At roughly 2:40 p.m, half an hour before the school closed, and like clockwork, the sex workers shut their curtains so the kiddies couldn't see the sweaty slap and tickle within. The mucky bookshop at 3 Peter Street had a spattering of perverts perusing their plethora of porn. And in the 2 flats above, the brothel was as busy as usual. On the first floor, Sheila Lawrence was finishing off a nervous young man. As on the second, Jeanne Weston had a regular, 45-year-old Piers Chamebri of Stoke Newington. Jeanne had many regulars. As being a veteran of the sex trade, she was efficient without being pushy. She was polite and quiet, which made her an unlikely target for a drunken attack. And to quell the nerves of any anxious punters, she would often whistle a little ditty or hug them to her motherly bosom. As usual, Rena, her maid, was in the back room making a lukewarm cup of tea as the next client sat in the armchair waiting, and the radio played something soothing and erotic. As in Jeanne's pink and lace bedroom, she was pumped by Pierce for £3, as the air hung with the smell of sperm and lavender. But although lovemaking emanated from the window, death was coming to Peter Street. Outside of the black front door stood the bomber and his lookout, said to be Everett and Tabone, clutching a crude incendiary bomb made out of a bottle of petrol, a shotgun shell, and a simple blasting fuse. They pressed the bell to flat 2, Jeanne's flat. As always, Rena answered it.
Hello?
They replied,
I'm here for business.
being code for sex. Rena buzzed them in, and then she waited by the open second-floor door. Yet the client never came. The explosion sounded like a sharp pop, nothing more, as the flames erupted on the bend of the stairs between the ground floor and the first. And with the front door and the window of Jeanne's flat left open, a wind tunnel of fire whipped over the stairs like the red-hot tip of a dragon's tongue, scorching the tinder-dry walls of the stairs and bursting through both rooms of Jeanne's flat. Only Jeanne wasn't their target, and neither was Rena. The bombers had made a simple mistake. They'd rang the bell for flat 2, Jeanne's flat, whereas one floor below in flat 1 was Sheila Lawrence, a Maltese woman whose husband had recently fled England, and whose real name was Margaret Vassallo. Sheila recalled, "I was trapped halfway up the stairs, screaming, surrounded by flames. Suddenly a man called Budgie grabbed me by the arm and dragged her from the inferno. As the fire enveloped the building, smoke poured from every window, and the blaze on the second floor licked the roof tiles. 6 people coughed and sputtered in the street. 3 from the bookshop, as well as Budgie, Sheila, and Sheila's maid. But 3 were missing, their pained screams emanating from the top flat. Through a hot, dense cloud of black smoke, the naked frame of Jeanne's client, P.S. Chemebri, was precariously balanced on the windowsill, flames licking around him, and seeing no way out, he jumped from the highest window. Hitting the road hard after a 25-foot fall, he broke his back, and although in pain, at least he was alive. Inside, Jeanne struggled towards the window. With every breath she inhaled fire. Every bead of sweat boiled. Every hair singed. Her skin was peeling and blistered, and her lingerie had melted into her skin. Crawling over the broken glass of the shattered window, blinded, Jeanne jumped for her life. And with the fall breaking her ribs, her wrists, her face, puncturing her lung, and several other injuries it was impossible to determine. Although alive, her body lay splayed in the middle of Peter Street, still smoking and burning. Her maid Rena wasn't so lucky. Being trapped in the back room, although alive but unrecognizable, she was later found unconscious, cowering beside the dressing table. Both women were rushed to Roehampton Hospital, but they died of their injuries. In her statement, Sheila Lawrence, also known as Margaret Vassallo, ironically stated, "I hope to God I'm not next. A few weeks ago in Berwick Street, there was a similar fire at a house of some friends of mine, another in Romilly Street, and this was the third." And although the press speculated that a maniac was on the loose, Detective Chief Superintendent Albert Wickstead, the gangbuster who broke up the Syndicate, knew exactly what this was. So by the Saturday, Joseph Frendo and Albert Tabone were charged with murder. But as I've already said, the law only serves the rich and the powerful. Silver and Misford denied any involvement. Everett was never found. Mikhailov had a cast-iron alibi, and with not enough evidence against Tabone, he was freed. Joseph Frendo was tried at the Old Bailey on the lesser charges of conspiracy to cause an explosion and to endanger life. And although found guilty, he was acquitted on appeal, and the deaths of Jeanne Weston and Rena Conzimu remain unsolved. Likewise, on the 8th of July 1975, when the collapse of the Syndicate led to both Silver and Misford being convicted of their part in the 1956 murder of Tommy Scarface Smithson, Misford was acquitted, and although Silver was sentenced to life for conspiracy to murder, again he was cleared on appeal. The gang who had brought so much misery to Soho had filled their pockets full of cash, made many lawyers and detectives incredibly wealthy, and they went on to live long and happy lives, having served no time for their crimes. But even in death, the woman they had accidentally killed would bring shame on the petty deeds of the Syndicate. Said to be a kindly mother figure, when Jeanne's will was read, she'd amassed £32,000 for her retirement, the equivalent of £500,000 today. But with no children of her own and no husband to inherit it, she bequeathed her entire fortune to 3 charities, which it is said helped her husband in his dying days: Cancer Research, the Imperial Cancer Research Fund, and the Institute for Cancer Research. As even in her death, she continued to help others, whereas the Syndicate only helped themselves. A spokesman for the Imperial Cancer Research Fund said, "We are extremely grateful for the money, no matter where it comes from." As Jeanne truly was, the proverbial hooker with a heart of gold.